And it is time, everyone. Welcome to Digital Earth from Stonehenge to Skyscrapers. My name is Mitch. I am your host. Joining me are Chun Yu, our curator of space sciences, and Bob Raynolds, our research associate at the museum, and our presenter tonight. Now, as the program happens, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. You won't be able to see everyone else's chat, but I will, and we'll be keeping down your questions. The program will be about an hour. And then after that, if you'd like to stick around, we'll have a little extra time for Bob and Chun to weigh in on questions they weren't able to get to. And once again, I just want to remind you, we just opened a very cool exhibit on Stonehenge at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. And with that, I'll hand it off to Chun.
All right, thanks a lot, Mitch. And before we begin the program, I just wish to acknowledge that the Denver Museum of Nature and Science is on land today that is the traditional homes of the Cheyenne and Arapaho, who were the original stewards of the land. And we also acknowledge other indigenous tribes and nations that make Colorado home. So welcome to Digital Earth, Stonehenge to Skyscrapers. And for those of you who are seeing this program for the first time, the philosophy of this actually started in our planetarium, where we are able to basically immerse our audiences and make them feel like they are flying in space. And we realized that the power of the planetarium gives us and allows our audiences to have the perspective of astronauts as they view down up on the Earth from orbit. And so what we wanted to do was to replicate that experience for our audiences. But of course, now that much of the museum programming is online, we're replicating that experience and beaming that into your home. And as we've heard over the last 5-10 minutes, to people across the country and across the hemisphere even. But as Mitch said, the software that we're using is incorporating real imagery from satellites that are imaging the surface of our Earth. And the open space software is sponsored by NASA. And at the end of this program, we will also be putting up a link to a survey. And so we'd love to hear your feedback about how this program went and how we can improve it. And so with that, I want to turn it over to Bob Raynolds, who is a research associate and a geologist at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. And one other thing that I forgot to mention is that I will be navigating tonight and following Bob's directives. And so hopefully we won't crash too hard into the Earth, but since this is a live program, anything can happen. So Bob, over to you.
Great, well, thank you, Chun, very much. And thank you, Mitch, for hosting us this evening. And what we have planned for you tonight is an interesting story that's evolved a little bit as we've worked on it. We've been working on this for a little bit, looking at Stonehenge and skyscrapers. That was the original theme. And we're now looking at, in terms of the concept of what kinds of features on the Earth's surface can be seen from space that indicate that there's intelligent life down there. You know, is anybody there? And we're going to zoom in here. We're coming down on a piece of ground that you might recognize, but we're going to land ourselves in the parking lot at the Denver Museum. You'll see it in a moment as it'll come into view. And as we go down, you'll see that the city of Denver becomes clear. And in a moment, we'll pull back out. We'll go in the opposite direction, and we'll sort of look at what kinds of features are visible at different elevations. And we've got a program now we're calling Digital Earth Academy that we run for elementary school students, and it's been funded by an outside source. And it allows us to talk about these topics to grade school students. And so we've used the vernacular of, you know, what do you see from the elevation of a balloon? What do you see from the elevation of an airplane? And what would you see if you were up at the elevation of the International Space Station? So those are, we might think about that this evening as well. But here, you've got a pretty good view of the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. You see Colorado Boulevard on the right-hand side running north-south, bottom to the top. And the museum is the bright structure there. It's got solar panels on the roof, which are sometimes not known by the people inside the building, but there are a lot of solar panels on the roof. We do generate a considerable amount of our electricity with our own solar panels. But the indication right there, I see some parking spaces available. So if you do get a chance to come down and visit the museum, come and see the Stonehenge exhibit, which we'll be referring to that here in a little bit. But we're gonna back out from the museum, and I just want to point out various features that you can see from different elevations. So we're up at a balloon elevation here, and you can see City Park, you can see the zoo, you can see the duck pond or the lake in the middle of City Park, and the museum is pretty bright feature there on the right. But as we back up a little bit more, we're going to be seeing the downtown area of the city of Denver. And there are some skyscrapers in Denver, but we're going to look for bigger ones around the world in a few minutes. And you can see that some of the buildings are visible because of their shadows, and some of the buildings are more visible because of their shape. And you might recognize the Pepsi Center, you might recognize the Broncos Stadium there on the lower left. And as we back up a little bit further, these features that are quite diagnostic and clearly made by man because of their shape and form become less and less distinct as you get up to high airplane elevations here. And as we get even above higher than airplanes go, you'll see that the form of the city of Denver becomes a little bit less clear, and you might still see some road networks, but to find the city is a little bit more difficult as we get up to an elevation here that'd be a little bit closer to what you might see if you were up in the low Earth orbit of the space station. We're going to move a little bit to the southwest, crossing the Front Range, and we're going to cross over the top of the mountains here, and we're going to pause over the northern part of the San Luis Valley here in just a minute. We've got to go a little bit further south, and we're going to come right now. We're coming into the San Luis Valley, and I just wanted to point out some features here that we can see quite distinctly, and we might drop down just a little bit to get a little bit closer to these. But one of the features that is really quite distinctive, particularly in the Western United States, are patterns, and you'll see green features coming into view now. And I might ask you to think about what these are. Many of you will be familiar with it. We're in the San Luis Valley. It's these are irrigation features, and these are, of course, center pivot irrigation fields in the western part of the San Luis Valley. And in many cases, they're growing potatoes. So the Rio Grande River is there flowing to on the lower part of the screen. And then you can see a variety of Pac-Man shaped features that are really quite distinctive and readily visible from the elevation of the International Space Station. And these are irrigated fields. One of the things that people, when we ask, what do you see from space, people will think about features like great walls, or they'll think about big buildings. But one of our most distinctive features are actually these agricultural patterns. And in this case, these are circular features with a sprinkling system that goes around in a circle, creating a very distinctive zone of vegetation, which of course are the farmers' fields. We're going to back up a little bit and see if we can move a little bit towards the west. And we're going to go over into Utah. And I just want to explore the area around Great Salt Lake and Salt Lake City. And looking at it from high above, one of the things that's quite interesting is the shape of the lake. Salt Lake has a very irregular shape. It's sitting in a basin. It's a natural lake. And one of the things that's characteristic of the Great Salt Lake is that it doesn't have any particularly straight boundaries. It's sort of, it sits low in a basin. Of course, it has been much bigger and deeper in the past, but it's an example of a natural lake. It does have a causeway that goes across it. If you look closely, you'll see in the upper part of the lake two different colors, and that's because the railroad causeway goes right across there, and the water chemistry is different on either side of the railroad causeway. So there is a color change that forms a sharp line there that Kachun's zooming in on, relatively near Promontory Point, which is where the railroad, the Transcontinental Railroad, the two sides touched right near here. So this is a natural lake. It has been slightly modified by man, but it's basically a natural phenomenon and appears fairly irregular in its shape. We'll see some other lakes here in a little bit that are quite different in character. But one of the things we want to take a look at here just south of Great Salt Lake is a copper mine. And I did see in the chat, somebody speculated that we might be able to see these from space. And of course you can. They're quite a distinctive change in the color. The ground has been disturbed by mining operations. There's been material moved and transported and stacked. And so you get a very distinctive color and also quite a distinctive geometry. And we're looking now at the Bingham Pit. This is the largest open pit mine in the world. It's about 3/4 of a mile deep and about 2.5 to, in some places, maybe 3 miles across. So it's a very large feature, one of the largest man-made features on the face of the earth, and it's readily visible from very high altitude. If you look closely at it, and our computer sort of struggles a little bit with the topography because the walls are very steep, it's got a series of benches or terraces. Trucks drive up and down from the very bottom of the mine up to the rim, and they drive along those benches. And some of you might have heard this, but there was a big landslide there in 2013. A significant portion of the northeastern side of that mine collapsed, and it was quite an engineering challenge to get things back into shape so they can continue to mine. The principal product of this mine is copper, and over 20 million tons of copper have been mined from the Bingham Pit. Again, the largest open pit mine in the world. There are other open pit mines around. Some of you mentioned in the chat the Crescent mine in Colorado, which is down at Cripple Creek, a gold mine. And there are numerous additional copper mines in the states of Arizona, and then, of course, along the Andes Mountains down in South America. So that's a relatively distinctive feature on the face of the earth, and again, caused by man. We're going to migrate a little bit to the south, still staying in Western United States. And we're going to go down and look at a city that has grown in the desert next to a big lake. And you can be thinking about which lake I might be talking about and which city might be sitting next to the lake. And we're going to go down and look at the city of Las Vegas. And it's a very interesting area where people have settled in relatively arid land, in an area that doesn't have a lot of water resources. And the city of Las Vegas, as many of you know, has grown very quickly in the last several decades, or in the last 30, 40 years. And Chun has organized a video, and we might play the video here. It starts in 1984 and it goes through time. It's coming from Google Earth, and you're seeing the city of Las Vegas grow. If you look closely, you'll see the footprint of the city growing. And we're going to run the video several times. It goes right up to about 2016. So right about now, and then it'll flip back to 84, 85. And you can watch the city of Las Vegas grow. But if you look a little bit to the right, you're looking at the lake next to the city. And many of you know, of course, that Lake Mead is there, defined by the Hoover Dam. And if you look at the size, so we're starting again at 80s, we're coming in, watch the size of Lake Mead change through time. And it sort of ebbs and wanes a little bit, but it's generally getting smaller. As you can see there, the water in Lake Mead today is about 40% full. The city of Las Vegas had to make an emergency extra tunnel down to the bottom, under the ground and into the bottom part of that lake, in order to be sure that they had sufficient access to water even as the lake levels fell. And one of the challenges we face in the arid southwestern United States, particularly as the water flow in the Colorado River system diminishes, we've got lots of people down there, millions and millions of people who rely on the water from the Colorado River for their sustenance. Let's back out a sec, Chun, and we'll just eyeball Lake Mead from above. And I just want to point out, it's probably made up of a series of images here. You can see some color changes in the lake. Those are because of multiple images, but Lake Mead is a lake in the desert. And a little bit different than Salt Lake. You'll see that Lake Mead has a shape that reflects the fact that it is a river system that has been barricaded and dammed. And the Hoover Dam is at the lower left-hand side of the screen. And Lake Mead is filling the Colorado River Valley. It's essentially the lowermost edge of the Grand Canyon country. And it's an artificial lake, of course, made by man. And if you were in space looking down at the Earth's surface, you would see Lake Mead as being an unusual feature. That little bit of pale blue in there has to do with the way they've compiled the images of the lake. It's the water doesn't really change color there in the middle part of that lake. But if we back up a little bit more, you'll get a feeling of the whole lake, and you'll see that the Colorado River is coming in from the upper right, and that it's feeding down towards the Hoover Dam. The Grand Canyon, if we back up far enough, we'll see the Grand Canyon there on the right-hand side of your screen. And so Lake Mead is an anomalous feature in the desert, and it might signal that somebody's down there doing construction, in this case, making dams. And since we've got it here, Kachun, on the uppermost right corner of your screen is another lake. This is Lake Powell. Similar story. If you look at it closely, you'll see that in the middle of a desert, there is a lake, and that lake has been made because the river's valley has been filled with water. And this, of course, is the Glen Canyon Dam that defines Lake Powell. And it's also relatively low. The water levels in Lake Powell are relatively low today because of the drying of the Colorado River system. We're going to back out a little bit and keep this thread of what kinds of things can we see from space. And we're very proud of our cities in the United States. We're very proud of the buildings in our cities. And let's go to Manhattan and see what we can see in Manhattan. And we're going to take a little bit of time to look at the features from above. And of course, those of you who've been to New York City, it's extraordinarily impressive. You're surrounded by skyscrapers. But if you look straight down from above, some of these buildings that are extremely impressive are somewhat modest in terms of their visible footprint as seen from directly above. And we're going to come down into the central part of Manhattan. You've got Central Park up there to the north, and this is the island of Manhattan. It's got the Hudson River on the left, the East River on the right, and we're going to be zooming into a portion of Midtown here. And the buildings are visible because of their shadows in this case. So you'll see some shadows here. We're going to see that several other times in this presentation, but we're coming right down on a building that's casting a very distinctive shadow. And we have wonderful resolution here as we get closer in. And this is the Empire State Building. And the Empire State Building is over 1,400 feet tall. There were times when it was the tallest building in the world. It was surpassed by others. But the shape of the Empire State Building is very robust. It's got sort of a roughly pyramidal shape. The bottom is very stout and big, and then it tapers up to a tall, thin tower. And the very top of the Empire State Building has a big transmission tower. I think it's television and radio tower up on the very top. There's a great big spike up on the very top of the Empire State Building, as many of you know. The visitors platform is just down there below. You can sort of see a little bit of a rim. And if you visit the Empire State Building, you can stand on that platform and gaze at the city of Manhattan, New York City all around you, the island of Manhattan. And but you don't look straight down, because if you look straight down, you just have a terrace below you. And you can use a telescope there and gaze around to see people way down on the streets below, on the city streets of New York City. They're also building a modern kind of building in New York that takes up a much smaller footprint. And there's some very tall towers being built now that have even less impressive footprints, but they're extremely tall. And I think that just to the right, Kachun, you might find one of them if the imagery is young enough. And it's really changing the skyline of Manhattan. For those of you who've been to New York City recently, these tall, super tall buildings are built on only about a quarter of a block, and they are a whole new style of construction in the city of New York. And they'll cast big shadows, but they're relatively thin buildings. They look sort of like little spires. And so the skyline of New York City is changing quickly, and it has to do with the novel construction technologies, new ways of building elevators and elevator cables, and that's changing the way we are building our skyscrapers in the city of New York. We're going to take one more quick view here in the United States, and then we're going to do a world tour. We're going to look around the world and ask ourselves about what kinds of features can be seen from space, focusing on archaeology where practical, but also looking at modern structures as well. So our last stop here on the East Coast is going to be down in Washington, D.C. We're just going to move down a little bit to the southwest. And we're going to look at the nation's capital and see what kinds of features we can see there, again, looking down from space. And you will see it's a little bit of a tricky business. Washington, D.C. itself is somewhat hard to find. It's as we move down from New York, we go past Philadelphia and Baltimore, and eventually we're going to find ourselves up on the Potomac River coming into the nation's capital. And we're going to focus, as you might well guess, on some of the major features that can be seen in the nation's capital, and many of you have been there. We're going to be looking at a monument in Washington, and it's going to be casting a nice shadow. It itself is not quite, it's not very visible, although it's 500 feet tall and 550 feet tall. It's right there in the center of your screen, and what you're really seeing is the shadow. You're seeing the mall, the Washington Mall, the Smithsonian be to the right, and the Washington Monument is straight ahead, and the Lincoln Memorial is to the left. And the Washington Monument, although very impressive on the ground, is difficult to see from space unless it's casting a nice shadow, as it is here in this case. And many of you will recognize some of the museums associated with the Smithsonian up and down on either side of the mall there. So the question that we were asking the students was which buildings would last longer. The students are always fascinated by how long buildings will last, and that brings us back to archaeology. Many of you will remember there was an earthquake it was 8 or 10 years ago on the East Coast, and it cracked the Washington Monument. And the Washington Monument had scaffolding on it for many years as they were repairing the crack. So we might speculate that some of these tall, very spindly structures might not last for millennia or for thousands of years. And we're going to look at some structures that have lasted for thousands of years. We're going to back out now, and we're going to cross the North Atlantic Ocean, and we're heading for England, and we're heading for the Salisbury Plains of southeastern England. And as many of you will guess, we're now going to look at Stonehenge, and I'll challenge you to sort of imagine before we get there what it might look like as we arrive. So you've seen our cities in the United States. We're coming, that's the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal. We're crossing up across France and the English Channel, and we're coming down into southeastern England. And Kachun and I and Mitch, we've spent a lot of time looking at Stonehenge from above, and you will see it's a challenge. As we come down here into southern England, you'll see agricultural patterns. The fields are there. They're quite different from the fields in the United States. The fields in England tend to be more irregular and in many cases smaller in size. And so as we get a little bit closer, again, hard to see much footprint of humans here at this elevation. We're at space station elevation, but we're dropping down towards airplane elevation. And here we're coming down into the southern part of England, the British Isles, and we're looking for Stonehenge. And if you see it, give a shout, but it's a pretty hard thing to find. And we've learned to find a few landmarks here to help us in. You'll see the field shapes here are quite irregular. There are some rectangular ones and some square ones, maybe even one or two circular ones, but they're different shaped polygons, of course, as the land has been subdivided over many years and many generations. Stonehenge itself is coming into view here. I can sort of see some of the landmarks that let me know where it is. It's in a triangular shaped field, and there's sort of a crescent from which people observe it. and I can see the crescent, I can see the triangular shaped field. So I know that we're coming into the right target here, but you will see that the feature itself, so that was so prominent in the photograph that was behind Mitch a few minutes ago, is pretty hard to see from above, difficult to see from above. And as we come down even closer, one of the things that's challenging is that the stones in Stonehenge, although they're very massive, they're not very tall. They're only 15, 20 feet tall, 30 feet tall, and they don't cast very big shadows. So the pattern is very impressive, the character is very impressive, but the shadows aren't very great. And so here you're seeing the Stonehenge view from the side, which is truly impressive. And of course, those rocks are massive and immense, and they move those rocks the distance of over 140 miles to get them here. Some of the major rocks were moved that distance, which that's the distance from Denver to Pueblo. So if you can imagine hauling rocks across country, they came from Wales, and it's an extraordinarily impressive feature and a very impressive feat, and a testament to the people who built it and their intentions of having a monument that would last through time, which it has. And they've created one of the most impressive monuments on the surface of the earth. It was built about 3000 BC and in multiple stages. And some of the new information that's covered in the exhibit at the Denver Museum and in recent publications talks about the fact that it might have been built in multiple stages. And in fact, it may have initially been built closer to where the rocks came from up in Wales, and then disassembled, and the rocks were transported the 140 miles to the Salisbury Plain. So the source of some of the bluestones, as they call the metamorphic and volcanic rocks, is right here. Not a very prepossessing place. There's a zone where the rocks, the geologists recognize the same rock, and this is the place where the original some of the original Stonehenge rocks come from. And you can well imagine the speculation about how they got moved from here in Wales down to the Salisbury Plain, and were they dragged across the land, or were they actually transported maybe by water and on barges? There's a couple of different theories about that. But in any case, it is an extremely impressive testimony to the ability to organize work and labor a long, long time ago to create monuments that have lasted through the ages. We're going to now migrate away from England. We're going to cross Europe, and we're going to go down to Egypt. And you can well imagine what we might try to find in Egypt, reflecting our concept here of what kinds of features can be seen from space. You're seeing the Mediterranean, you're seeing the Nile Delta, the Nile River, the Red Sea, the Gulf of Suez, the Gulf of Aqaba. And the Nile River is defined by the green thread crossing the arid easternmost Sahara Desert, the Fayum Depression, and then the city of Cairo is a grayish feature as it's growing out across the agriculture and irrigated lands of the Delta. And we're going to be coming down just to the west of Cairo, looking at the area of Giza, and we'll see if you can recognize pyramids from above. So we're at space station elevation. We'll be dropping down to high altitude aircraft elevation, and you'll start to see some features, and they're quite distinctive once you see them. And I hope many of you are seeing it right now. I see, yeah, your people in the chat are seeing them, and the open space software is paneling in. We'll get some higher resolution coming in here, and you're looking at the three prominent pyramids. The northern one is Cheops, and Khafre is the middle one, and the one to the south is Menkaure. And these three pyramids are, of course, very visible from the city of Cairo, particularly on a clear day. And the northernmost one is the biggest one. That's Cheops Pyramid, and it's about 450 feet high. And these are extraordinarily rigid structures. They will last through time. The rocks have been quarried from the pyramids. Some of the surface materials have been carried away to build some of the buildings in Cairo, but these pyramids are going to last a long time. They're extraordinarily stable, and they're magnificently engineered. The rocks fit together precisely. And if you go to the corner of this pyramid that we're looking at right here, We used to be able to climb it, and I've climbed it a couple of times. You could pass that no climbing sign in the dark. We used to start about 4 o'clock in the morning, climbing up the edge of the pyramid, and we would climb up to the very top and try to have dawn at the top of the pyramid. And Napoleon is supposed to have signed his name or written an N up at the top, and I've never been able to find the N from Napoleon up at the top of the pyramid. But there, as you study the ground around the pyramids, they're built on the Giza Plateau next to Cairo, and the ancient Egyptians who built these pyramids about 2,500 BC, they prepared the land before they put the pyramids down, and they beautifully sculpted the terraced land there, creating a flat surface. And they moved huge rocks in making that flat surface, to the point where even as a geologist, I have a hard time noticing or finding the difference between the native stone of the Giza Plateau and the rocks that have been moved to make the foundation for the pyramids. The rocks of the pyramids are a nummulitic limestone, a limestone that has beautiful fossils in it that are shaped like coins, which is where the word nummulite comes from. And they were quarried across the Nile River in quarries that you can still see behind the city of Cairo. So as we back out from the pyramids, they're among the most visible archaeological features on the face of the earth. And of course, other cultures built pyramids. There are pyramids in Mexico City. Some of the mound builders in central United States built mound-like pyramids. And there's, you might think of some of the stupas around the world as sort of pyramidal shapes, very resistant to the ravages of time. We're backing up the Nile River here, and I just want to, while we're here, we're going to visit a lake that's in the desert. And this, of course, is Lake Nassar that many of you will have heard about. It's ponded up behind a dam, the Aswan High Dam, that was completed in about 1970. And all kinds of stories about building this lake and defining a water reservoir in the middle of the desert. But it creates a very distinctive feature. Again, when you look at the Nile River, you can see the irrigation along the sides of the Nile River. So it gives you this green. But here, from very high altitude, you see a lake in the middle of the desert filling a dendritic pattern, or a pattern that's shaped by flowing water. And again, this would be a testament to somebody having constructed an artificial dam. So the pattern of these desert lakes, like Lake Mead and Lake Powell, here's Lake Nassar, and here's the High Aswan Dam. And you can see a very solid piece of construction, of course, a very strategic piece of Egypt's heritage here. And the waters from the lake are creating hydroelectricity at the dam. And of course, they're also being used for irrigation and year-round water supply for the Egyptian people. And there's some wonderful, essentially buried landscapes here. The river, the Nile, as it flooded to create the lake, flooded, including many archaeological sites, but it also flooded all these valleys. And you get these extraordinary patterns of submerged land where the waters of the lake are adjacent to the desert. And I had the chance one time to come down this lake in a paddle wheel steamer from Wadi Halfa, which is on the Sudan border. And I came down all the way to Aswan. And the paddle wheel steamer went very slowly. And we passed wonderful things in the night, like Abu Simbel. And I was frustrated by not having been able to see Abu Simbel from the paddle wheel steamer. So I found that you could take a hydrofoil back up. And I was a student in those days. And to get into Egypt, you had to change a substantial amount of money into Egyptian pounds. And so I had these Egyptian pounds, and I used them to purchase a ticket on the hydrofoil to get back up to see Abu Simbel, which is on the west side of Lake Nassar here. But we're going to keep on moving past Egypt, and we're going to just back up a little bit from this man-made lake, and we're going to cross the Red Sea, and we are going to head over towards the Persian Gulf. And some of you were speculating in the chat about what we might see in the Persian Gulf. And I saw some of you suggesting that we might see some features there. So some of you know what we might find. So we're crossing the Arabian Peninsula. You've got the Tigris and Euphrates coming into the Persian Gulf. You've got Qatar there on the left, Saudi Arabia, and we're coming down into the United Arab Emirates. Here you've got the entire Persian Gulf, the Straits of Hormuz. You've got Oman on the lower right. You've got Iran on the north, and we're coming down into the United Arab Emirates, which are a consortium of emirates that have come together under group government, and they've created amazing things. And some of you might have been to Dubai. We're coming down towards Dubai. The airport in Dubai is said to be the busiest airport in the world. And they say they're within 5 hours of half the world's population. And they've built this amazing city in the desert. And they've done it in relatively short order. So we're going to see some of these remarkable constructions. Again, terraforming, where people are forming new features on the face of the earth that are visible from space. These are the Palm Islands, they call them. There's 2 of them, and there are a whole series of apartments and housing out on these islands and the fronds of the palm tree. Some of them are still under construction in the images we're seeing here, but I've been there and some of them are occupied now. People are moving out into these apartments. And of course, everybody's got a wonderful view of the water, and the city is gleaming in the distance, and you're out looking across the water. It's a marvelous place. And if we look a little bit to the right, you'll see a very strange pattern in the water, and it's a series of islands. If you look at it closely, you might recognize a pattern in these islands. So do people see a pattern? Do those islands look like they might be in a pattern? The pattern might be familiar. See if you can see what those pattern looks like. And yes, I think maybe someone's setting it in the chat, but these are islands that make up a pattern that looks like the world. And in fact, this is called the world. And you can purchase individual islands. And there's been a variety of people trying to purchase islands. And once you purchase your island, then you start to develop it. And if you look at this on Google Earth, and you guys can find this at home on Google Earth, you'll see that some of the islands are being inhabited, and people are building palazzos and helicopter landing pads and yacht landing ports and all kinds of things. So it's a pretty posh place, but it's still partly available. If you want to purchase an island, you can Google it, and I'm sure that somebody would allow you to purchase Madagascar, for example. But as we back out and sort of frame the view, Kachun has a time-lapse image of this view, and you'll see how quickly these things were built. Here's 1984, there's nothing there. And in about 1990, 94, there's still not much visible. And the year 2000, suddenly you can see these things sprouting, and in relatively short order, the tail end of the 90s and the early 2000s, they built these features. Again, we'll run it again. Here's 1990, 91, 93, 94, not much there, 97, not much there. 99, it starts to happen. And by 2007, 2008, 2009, they've blossomed out into the Persian Gulf. And it's a fantastic testimony to the construction efforts of many organizations. And here's how they do it. This is a Dutch company that's put together this boat, and it's actually a dredge system. They're sucking up sand from the backside of the boat, and they squirt it out through water in the front. And these boats are able to move around in the shallow waters of the Persian Gulf, and they excavate sand from the back, and they project it out the front, and they can build these artificial islands relatively quickly, as you've seen. So a tremendous piece of work that is visible from space, an amazing feat. And of course, you can see the city skyline there in the background. And if you come to Dubai, these are fantastic buildings that have been constructed here. And many of you will be familiar with some of the tallest buildings in the world The Burj Khalifa is the tallest building in the world, and it's coming into view here, but it's a very tall and spindly building and difficult to see from space, despite the fact that it's a very prominent feature. And we'll start to see some shadow from it. It's located right next to that little body of water there. And we're coming in close enough that you'll start to see it's a shimmering aluminum building, a fantastic construction. And it's about 2,700 feet high. It was completed in about 2010. And it's one of the most amazing buildings in the world. You can see here, by comparison, the pyramid. This is a scaled diagram that Chun put together with the pyramid on the left, the Washington Monument, the Empire State Building, and the Burj Khalifa on the right, up to 800 meters tall there. And it's an extremely impressive building. You can see it on the screen there. And here's what it looks like from the ground. And it's not much taller than a palm tree. That's what we would tease the students. And of course, the perspective is everything. So here the building is vastly taller than the palm tree. But if we look at it from the side, here's what the building looks like. It's a magnificent tower, and you can go up to numerous observation platforms. And I think you have to pay extra money to get the very high ones. We've been to sort of the mid-level ones, and the view you get from there is fantastic. You can see all of the Emirates. You see the Persian Gulf and the desert behind it, and the magnificent constructions that have been built in just the last few decades in this area. That only a few years ago was sandy desert shores and modest fishing villages. And of course, it's the money from oil and gas that has built this city, this civilization. And the Emirates are keenly interested in projecting themselves into the future, building sustainability, and they're looking to the time beyond oil. So they're hoping that their cities will be attractive to people from around the world as centers of commerce and entertainment, which is, of course, it's turning out to be. We're now going to be moving across Asia, and we're going to make a stop in China. And just to give you a sense, we're going to visit several places in Asia, then we're going to end up in the Western United States. So our goal is to get us to the Western United States, but we're going to come and visit China here and look at a variety of features. And China is a country that is, as you all know, developing very rapidly. This is an image taken just a few weeks ago. And I'm not sure if you have a cursor, Chun, but there's a brown spatch in the middle of that scene, which the clouds are very white, and there's a pale brown lobe. I'm not sure if you can zoom into that, Chun, at all, but I'm just trying to guide people to what I see as a pale brown lobe. And it's sort of coming from the left, heading to the right. And it's the sandstorm that was blowing in China back in earlier March. And some of you might have heard the news reports that the thing that's sort of coming from upper left to lower right, it's sort of brownish in color, is not a cloud. That's actually dust and dirt being blown off of the Gobi Desert, and is blowing right towards Beijing. So one of the great challenges that people have in China is the air quality. Many of you have heard that story. Some of you probably visited Beijing and seen that. But this challenge that they have is that their cities are often shrouded in sand and dust from the west. We're going to come down to Beijing here. And as we come down to Beijing, I'll ask you to think of what you might see. We're coming down to, again, China. You might think of walls. People think the Great Wall of China. Let's see if we can find it. So we're coming down straight onto Beijing, and I'll ask you to sort of tell me what you might say in the chat what you see. And it's hard to see Beijing right now, but we're getting closer. There's a bright area sort of at 2 o'clock, which is the airport. So right now, because I know it's the airport, I can see the airport as a landmark. And as we get closer, it'll show up like the airport. And it looks a little bit like DIA, actually, when seen from above, a great big modern airport. And the central part of Beijing is to the lower left. Again, at this elevation, and we're getting below spacecraft level. We're going to be getting down to high altitude aircraft here in a moment. And a little bit hard to see, but you'll start to see some of the geometric structures in downtown Beijing showing up. The airport with its numerous runways and very bright white is up in the upper right. And we're going to be coming right down in on Tiananmen Square. And Tiananmen Square and the Forbidden City are very large features, and their geometrical patterns are very distinctive once you get to about this elevation, which would be high aircraft elevation. And you'll start to see the shape of the Forbidden City and the Tiananmen Square. Tiananmen Square is to the bottom, the big long rectangular feature, and the Forbidden City is to the top. And these are beautiful features when seen from the ground. I think Kachun has a photograph he took of the Forbidden City, and it's very prominent. There's some beautiful features. And if you go to Tiananmen Square, there's a wonderful museum. It's sort of a cultural history museum on Tiananmen Square, and has a wonderful collection of features to see. I flew into Beijing a couple of years ago, and one of the things that surprised me as I was coming in we were flying in from Karachi to Beijing, and coming into Beijing, there's this strange blue stuff that you could see from quite high up. And I was curious to what the strange blue stuff was. And we got down closer to the ground, and I saw more and more of the blue stuff. And finally, we got right down on the ground at the Beijing airport. And it's very easy to take a subway or a train into town. And along that train, as it was above ground, you can see the blue stuff is tarps, and they've put tarps down to hold the sand from construction sites. So as you get close to Beijing, there's a strange blue that is the construction site covers, which they're using there. We're going to go just to the north of Beijing, and we were asking you about what kind of features you might see. And everybody hopes to see the Great Wall as we get to this elevation, and it's surprisingly difficult to find. In fact, Kachun and I and others have spent quite a bit of time trying to trace the Great Wall of China as seen from above. And one of the things that's quite clear is that it is hard to see compared to, for example, reservoirs or farmers' fields or interstate highways or cities or airports. The Great Wall of China, although a very impressive architectural structure spanning, many hundreds of miles, is relatively narrow, and the terrain on either side of it is very similar. And so you can start to see it there. It's the irregular feature crossing from the lower right of your screen to the upper left. It's not the roads. The roads are to bring tourists to it, and there's a complex there where you can visit it. And the Great Wall of China, when you know what you're looking for, you can dimly see it from space. You can see it from aircraft altitudes when you know what you're looking for. Here we're at balloon level, as I would tell young students, and you can actually see it quite nicely if you were in a balloon. And Kachun has a photograph that he took of it here, and you can see what it looks like. And you'll see it's although very long, it's relatively narrow, and it's also quite irregular. So it doesn't have a geometrical shape or character that grabs you from a distance. So your eye, which is looking for patterns, doesn't really see the Great Wall of China from space. So that's something that we've learned. You see the interstate highways there, or the double lane highways, much more easily because their geometrical shapes are more regular, and they're longer and straighter, and you can see their pattern more clearly. We're going to back up a little bit and go into the ground that's just to the west of Beijing, heading towards what they call the Loess Plateau and the eastern part of the Gobi Desert. And Kachun, I'm not quite sure what you'd like to focus on out here, but we're sort of we've got a variety of choices. But this is an area that is being terraformed today. It's been worked on by many generations of people, and there's a lot of effort to stabilize the ground in the Loess Plateau area. They've been building terraces, and Kachun, I'm not sure if you can find the terraces in the Loess Plateau.
Yeah, I think I'll try and find some of the dendritic terraces.
Yeah, so we'll look for some of the terracing, which is a tremendous testimony to people creating terraced ground for agriculture in what's otherwise very rugged landscape in what's called the Loess Plateau. And this is an ongoing saga. The Loess is a German word. It means windblown silt, and it's accumulated in thousands, 800 feet thicknesses and more in this part of central China. And it's because of this wind pattern that you just saw earlier, blowing the dust and debris from the Gobi area into central China. You'll see the drainages here are very dendritic, is the word Chun used. They're sort of shaped like fingers and like leaf patterns. And as we come in close, it's sometimes a challenge to get close enough down to see the terraces, but you'll see that the land that looks pretty much unblemished from this elevation, the closer you get to it, the more you'll see that people have been at work in here. And many of these ridges, which are relatively steep and precipitous, have been sculpted by generations of farmers carving terraces. And you're starting to see some there right in the central part of the screen. And different parts of the Loess Plateau have different levels of terracing, but there's a tremendous effort has gone into creating flat ground in what otherwise is extremely rugged landscapes. And you'll see patterns in here. There's been big efforts to plant trees. This is an area where in recent years there's been a lot of tree planting going on some of these terraces. They're trying to keep the slopes stable, and you'll recognize as you get close enough, you'll see the hand of man modulating these landscapes and creating flat ground that can be planted both for crops and for trees. Now, the other thing that's happening in the western part of China is they're trying to stabilize the desert itself. And as we move back away from the dendritic drainages of the Loess Plateau, you'll see the complicated geography and geometries here. But as we move just to the west, we're becoming into the fringes of the Gobi Desert. And this is an area that's relatively arid, of course, as the name implies. And there's a wide variety of efforts going on out here to stabilize the sand dunes. And this is an area where the wind blows fiercely from the west towards the east. And the people living out here have been charged with stabilizing the desert. And there's a variety of ways they're doing that. One of them is to create sort of a corduroy of they'll take straw and they'll make squares, pushing straw into the sand, creating sort of a gridwork, a waffle-like structure of straw and sand, and thereby stabilizing the dunes. But another one that we've just picked up on recently, and there's some papers about this that are quite interesting, is the use of cryptobiotic soils. And many of you are familiar with cryptograms or cryptobiotic soils from the southwestern US, our national parks. There's a river running right through the central part of this, the lower part of the screen, and then a road up to the top. And the road has dark areas on either side of it. And we've looked closely at this, and there's a Desert Research Institute right here in the lower part of the screen. And that dark color where they've changed we call it the albedo, or the amount of reflectance, is suggestive of having been sprayed with a combination of polymers that are fixative, sort of a gluey kind of polymer, and then cryptobacteria and a water, there's some kind of a water holding material. They mix it all together and they spray it on the ground, and it recreates something like the cryptobiotic soils of the arid southwestern United States. And so it's a way of trying to stabilize the sand dunes. In this particular area, they're trying to keep the sand dunes from blowing across the road. And the Chinese people are experimenting with ways to really make some rather drastic changes to the surface of these deserts so that less sand blows towards their cities in the South China plains. We're going to scoot back out into the South China Sea and see one other place where the Chinese people are modifying the surface of the land, in this case, the surface of the sea. And some of you have heard about the Spratly Islands. We're going to take just a quick look at Woody Island, which is one of the Spratlys. And this is one of the areas where some of you probably heard about the fact that the Chinese people are trying to exercise control over big swaths of the South China Sea. And there's a lot of territorial disputes out here, depending on how you want to slice the land between Vietnam on the west and the Philippines on the east and China up in the north. And the Chinese have come to some of these islands and have been modifying them substantially. And you'll see as we get in close to this one, you'll see that they've created not only a a seaport where they've been able to berth some of their large ships, but they've also created a very large landing strip. I think we'll see it as it comes into focus. This is Woody Island, and you'll see a huge runway. The runway is about 2.5 kilometers long, and you'll see these big harbors. So the harbors on the left-hand side will accommodate the Chinese fleet, and the landing strip will accommodate the Chinese air forces. And this has been a cause of considerable concern. And it's been in the news even in the last couple of weeks, because the Americans, we've sent in we've got aircraft carriers that are patrolling the South China Sea, trying to control or trying to keep international waters open. The French have sent in one of their nuclear submarines into the South China Sea. So this is an area where terraforming is taking on new dimensions, and it's both visible from space and carrying, of course, geopolitical implications. We're nearing the end of our presentation, but I wanted to take you, we're heading back to North America, but we're going to stop quickly in Japan. And I just want to show you one other very interesting example of terraforming. And the terraforming in Japan has been conducted near Tokyo. There's some wonderful things to see. We're going to come down into the city of Tokyo, the capital of Japan. And here it is on the island of Honshu and the Tokyo harbor. And as we come down to the city of Tokyo is the brownish gray. The surrounding green is the undeveloped or less developed land. But as we come down into the Tokyo harbor, I'll ask you to look at the shape of the shorelines and see if you can see some unusual patterns in the shapes of the shorelines on the land around the Tokyo harbor. And as we get to this elevation, here we're just below spacecraft elevation. We're coming down into what you might see looking out the window from a high-flying aircraft. And you'll see a curiously regular pattern, squares and indentations that are rectangular. And this is land that has been reclaimed from the harbor, and it's built on fill. They've been expanding the city of Tokyo out into the bay, and these are examples of man-made features on the edge of the Tokyo harbor. There's one of their main airports there coming in, and you'll see a very sort of geometric pattern to the coastlines here, and it illustrates that the hand of man has been active in this area. And we're going to admire Tokyo here for a moment, but then we're going to back out and we'll show you another example of this. And we're going to take you to more familiar ground, perhaps, and come into the western part of the United States and to a city that is familiar to many of you. And we will ask you about what might be going on in this city, which is guarded by the Golden Gate. So we're going to cross the Pacific Ocean, make a relatively big hop here, pass over the islands of Hawaii, the Emperor Seamounts, and we're going to come into the coast of California. You can see the Central Valley and the Sierra Nevadas. You can see Baja California. We're looking at the entire state of California, the Sierras at the top, Central Valley in the middle, and the San Francisco Bay area coming into view. And of course, we're going to go in beyond the Golden Gate Bridge and look a little bit at the San Francisco Bay for our final stop. And you'll appreciate that as we get close to San Francisco, I'm going to be asking you to look at where the airport is for the city of San Francisco. And for some of you might be familiar with the suburbs to the south, Redwood City, for example, as you drop south from the city of San Francisco. And we're going to be seeing an example here in our own country where land has been built on out into the bay. And you'll see as we get a little bit closer, you'll start to recognize the character of the airport here in San Francisco. Many of you have flown here, and you'll appreciate that you land essentially at sea level in the bay. And it's built on ground that has been reclaimed from the San Francisco Bay. And if we back out a teensy bit here at Kachun and just drop to the south, I just want to point out Redwood City, which is just down to the south a little bit, heading down towards Palo Alto. And it's just some of these coastal communities. There it is to the right with some of those geometric features. And one of the challenges here, of course, this is a seismically active area, as you all know, and we've been building our infrastructure out on the what's called the Bay Muds, the relatively unconsolidated sediments of the San Francisco Bay. And they're subject to liquefaction during big earthquake events. And so there's a lot of infrastructure here along the periphery of the San Francisco Bay that may be subject to some disruption when there is an earthquake. And it's not if there's an earthquake, of course, it's when there's an earthquake. And we might look at the very southern end of the Bay Area here, crossing it's probably the Dunbarton Bridge, but we'll come down into the South Bay. And again, the hand of man becomes visible from space. That's the Ames Air Force Base, and the blimp hangars. You can actually see the blimp hangars there. But the land here is all carved up into interesting geometric patterns. And there's a process of extracting salt and salts from the San Francisco Bay just north of San Jose. So we've got San Jose in the lower part of the screen, and the upper part of the screen is the southernmost edge of the San Francisco Bay. And it's got some very interesting sort of geometrical patterns here that are associated with salt extraction. Again, something that would be visible from space. So as you were flying around, orbiting around the Earth, looking to see if there was intelligence down there, you'd start to recognize patterns like this as being made by some intelligent being. And we've had lots of discussions about what kinds of features you might see from space. I've noticed in the chat, some of you mentioned that if you looked at the world in the nighttime, you'd see the city lights. That's absolutely true. You'd see that for sure. One of the biggest things that it's been mentioned is if you look at the changes in the patterns of the surface of the Earth, the polar ice caps are diminishing, and that might be a sign that something is going on. And if you study the vegetation of the Earth in some way, if you had a way of sampling it, you'd recognize that we're at a time when vegetation is moving across the face of the Earth. And it was suggested to me by a colleague that we're at a time of a Pangea of vegetation as invasive species have crossed from one continent to another. And we've got lots of Asian plants inhabiting North America now, moved by people. And of course, there's other things that have happened in terms of the character of the animals, extinction of species, so that the hand of man is written very heavily in the landscape of biology and the animals and plants living on the planet. But I think we've covered a lot of ground, and you can see our beautiful world here. At this elevation, a little bit hard to discern that there are intelligent beings down there, but we can maybe take a couple of minutes for questions and answers. It's about 8 o'clock. And for those of you who need to scoot, well, that's certainly fine. But if you want to linger for just a few minutes, we might be able to take a few questions. If you put them in the chat, maybe Mitch can read them out to us. So we'll sort of turn it back over to Mitch. Thank you.
Thank you. That was a wonderful presentation. So cool. So cool. Yeah, and I just wanted to mention a couple things before. As Bob said, it's a school night. If you need to leave, that's perfectly fine. We're going to stick around for maybe 10 minutes or so and address some questions. I put a link to a survey in the chat, and we would be really grateful if you'd fill that out. We're always trying to figure out how we can make our programs the best they can be. And our next Digital Earth is Wednesday, May 19th, and the topic will be oceans. So mark your calendars. All right, and so to get to some of the questions. So we had a lot of great predictions of what we could see from space, and a lot of them we saw during the program. We looked at the Great Wall of China, the pyramids, the Hoover Dam. We went by the Suez Canal, the Crescent Mine in Cripple Creek, the Copper Mine, man-made islands in Dubai. What about Machu Picchu?
So we've looked at Machu Picchu from space, and it's pretty subtle. It's the kind of thing that Kachun and I sort of cringe when someone's asked that question, because unless we've got it sort of keyed up ahead of time, we might not be able to find it. So I'm not sure, Kachun, if you want to take a stab at that. But Machu Picchu is very difficult to see from above because the buildings are relatively small. They're relatively irregular. The landscape down there is extraordinarily rugged, as you might know if you've been there. So Machu Picchu can probably not be seen from the elevation of a space station. It would be hard to see from the elevation of an airplane. Once you got down to balloon level, you'd be able to recognize some of the geometric features associated with it.
And a related question, what's the smallest human-made structure currently distinguishable from satellite orbit?
Well, so that's a very good question. And I'm going to ask you to think about resolution, meaning like, how do you resolve things? And we've asked that question a lot, and it has to do with the contrast. So for example, if you have a very dark object on a very light background, you will see it. If it tends to be elongated or it has a geometry that is distinctive, you will tend to see it. So I would offer you, to answer your question, I would offer you, for example, a road in a desert area. So for example, we might take a single lane asphalt highway in a relatively bright desert area, and you will see it from a tremendous distance because the geometry and the contrast will allow you to see it. I think Kachun is finding Machu Picchu. I'm very impressed. You can appreciate that from this elevation, we're sort of getting to balloon elevation, and you know, I'm assuming that we're zooming in on it, but it is pretty subtle. And I have not actually physically been to Machu Picchu myself yet, but I do know that the Inca Trail goes there. I do know there are those switchbacks. So I'm seeing features I see switchback trail, and I'm assuming that the switchback trail is taking us up to the Machu Picchu, which must be on the left-hand side of the screen. And you can see how steep the terrain is here, famously steep. And of course, we're coming down the ancient city of the Incas. And at this elevation, now we're at balloon level, you can see that there's a pattern down there, but the actual city itself is complicated, multi-level terraces. Ken Wright and his group from Wright Water Engineering have worked on the water systems at Machu Picchu, and he's given a talk at the Denver Museum about ancient water systems. So hard to see from above.
Yeah, but great flying. I would add that I have tried to fly this program, and it is very difficult, and Kachun is a master of finding tiny features on a huge planet. So this is a good question someone had. In Dubai, they're building all these houses on sand. Is that a good idea?
Well, you know, the question is sort of the issue of constructing features on sand, or particularly at sea level, is a challenge. And sea level's rising globally, as you all know. It's actually rising about 3 millimeters per year on average. And that might seem like a relatively small number, but over time that would add up. And of course, the Palm Islands and the world are built essentially at sea level. There are big breakwaters that have been built around the Palm Islands, and also they're building breakwaters around the world that are sort of defining it. And their construction there is they're building very tall buildings they have tremendous foundations built down into the bedrock beneath the sand surface. And it's an area that is not particularly seismically active, although there would be earthquakes there from time to time. So I think it's relatively stable. These constructions will certainly last for, you could say the hundreds of years. When you start asking about what's going to last for thousands of years, that becomes quite an interesting question. And we've got a lot of construction across the whole world that might not last 1,000 years. And of course, the pyramids in Egypt have lasted 5,000 years. The Stonehenge has lasted roughly the same time, a little bit more. And then we look at our modern constructions like the Washington Monument, or even some of these big buildings here in Dubai. And will they last 1,000 years? Will they last 5,000 years? I don't have the answer to that, but it's something to think about in terms of the stability of our construction. And of course, you could answer that we'll continually modify these structures. We'll raise them above sea level as sea level rises, but it's going to be engineering challenges for future generations for sure.
Yeah, it's an amazing It's so cool to see it from this angle. So what about the greenhouses of Almeria? Are you familiar with those?
You know, I'm familiar with greenhouses.
I
But no,
Googled it. Yeah. In southern Spain, it's the largest concentration of greenhouses in the world.
oh, wonderful. Well, you know, actually, so I can speak a little bit to that because, you know, greenhouses are becoming more and more common. And I've not seen the greenhouses in Alameda, but I have seen them in Kenya, for example. They're very big greenhouses in Kenya where they grow flowers. And they would probably be visible from space because they're very geometric. The greenhouses that I'm familiar with in Kenya are rectangular, and they're in big patterns of rectangular greenhouses adjacent to each other, and it would make a very distinctive feature. I'm not sure if Kachun has the if he's fastened his seatbelt. I could take you to Kenya and show you some greenhouses. Okay, I think we're heading towards Kenya. We'll see if we can see some greenhouses in Kenya. And this is where they grow roses that they transport up to Europe. So it might be our last little spot. We're going to come in. This is Lake Victoria, is the big lake in the middle. Lake Turkana is up at the top of the screen. Kilimanjaro is sort of the little mountain with a bump on it in the middle. We've got to go in towards Lake Naivasha. So we're doing, let's see, keep on going straight north, a little bit north, a little bit north, a little bit right, a little bit to the right. There's Lake Victoria. And we're going to, this is a little bit of an experiment. No, keep going to the right. You're in Uganda and Lake Albert. We're going to drop down into south from Turkana, south from Baringo. Keep going a little bit south now. Keep coming in and go a little bit south. And we're going to see if we can find Lake Naivasha. And keep going a little bit south. It'll show up as a nice lake. Oh, there you go. That's okay. I'm oriented. That's a Lake Natron. Go north from Lake Natron. So into the right now, zoom straight down in there. And the lake to the right, not the one on the left, the one on the right. Lower, go, nope, that's Baringo. South. This is complicated. We're flying in many hands on the steering wheel here. A little bit south, Kachun, a little bit south. Look at that lake that's sort of pale blue. The south end of the pale blue lake. Green, it's looking green. And I'm hoping these will show up. There's a volcanic area there that they generate geothermal energy. I'm not seeing that. I know they're there. Keep on going. See if you can get a little closer. There's a wonderful geothermal energy facility here. Icelandic engineers helping the Kenyans produce a third of their energy from geothermal. It's back up a teensy scotch, and it's next to that lake on the left because they're using the water from the lake to water the greenhouses. So it may be the greenhouses don't show up. This is an area that does have greenhouses, but I do not see them. So it may be that the answer to the question is that the greenhouses are hard to find unless you know right where you're going. And I will invite the audience to use the tool Google Earth. That we use it a lot. And straight down in there, Kachun, there are greenhouses. I just right up against near the lake, and there's some closer to the lake because they've got to get the water out of the lake. So let's move up along that coast and see if we see some greenhouses. A little bit north, see if. And what I was advertising is on Google Earth, you guys can do this yourselves. You can fly somewhat similar patterns, and you would be able to explore yourselves. So you could go to Spain and look for greenhouses. And I'm sorry not to be able to give you greenhouses at this time, but
that's okay. It was quite a curveball at the last moment. So.
Well, thank you. Thank everybody. Thank you all for participating tonight. And thank you, Mitch, for hosting. And of course, Kachun for keeping us stable on our flight around the world. And we were at the wrong lake. Go to the next lake down, Kachun. There's another lake straight in down south, right there. Now I'm seeing greenhouses. Look at the south end of that. See if they're green. There. Oh, we put those things many of those are greenhouses. So and they're big plastic and glass enclosed features, and they're growing roses in them. Aha. So you can see greenhouses. We're probably at aircraft elevation here, so they show up. And if you saw that rectangular pattern, you might well be able to see that from space. So I'm glad we did find the greenhouses. But again, thank you all for participating. And we'll be running this program from about once every other month. And we invite you all to continue to participate in our Digital Earth experiences from the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. And thank you all very much, and good evening.
Good night, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. May 19th will be our next one. There is a link in the chat if you want to buy your tickets. And also, I'm going to post it one more time, just at the last moment, a survey that we really appreciate if you could fill out. There it is. And we'll give you a few seconds to click on that. And thank you again for joining us. Have a wonderful Wednesday evening.